Over at The Hill, they're saying this is their #1 trending column today. And it is written by the author that's joining us right now, Dr. Scott Atlas, MD with Stanford University. Doctor, it is a pleasure to have you with us here on Blaze TV radio and podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Name of your piece, The Data is In, Stop the Panic and End the Total Isolation. I want to give you a chance to give us a quick summary of the 5 facts that you have in your piece. But I want to start by asking a meta question, if I could. All right. Okay. So last Friday, I was on a conference call with some fellow faculty members of yours at Stanford after they released their serology study of Santa Clara County. One of the things that I have found fascinating, I mean, I have just been, shoulder deep in research on this story since it began a little more than a month ago. And what I have been fascinated by is that there's actually been quite a bit of disagreement within the expert community. I mean, people that have major credentials in this arena. Dr. Michael Osterholm, for example, has worked for the last 5 administrations. People at Oxford, Carnegie Mellon, Rockefeller have come forward to say, we're not sure this is the right thing that we are pursuing here. And your university, which is one of the elite universities in the country, has had several different individuals come forward now, starting with Dr. Ioannidis. He wrote a peer-reviewed paper almost a month ago, or well over a month ago now, questioning whether we had the data to go about this strategy. Can you explain to our audience why there has been so much pushback, even within the expert community, on Imperial College and to a lesser degree the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation models, why there's been so much division about this amongst people that typically on these kinds of matters seem to agree more often than not?
Well, I mean, part of the numbers basis for everything that's been said was necessarily based on projections and models. And there's one thing that models often, I would say, have in common. The most common thing models share is that they're always wrong. And the reason that they're wrong is because they're based on inputs that are assumptions. Mm-hmm. And those assumptions are incomplete or sometimes erroneous. This is not to impugn anyone. There's so many smart people involved in this, and no one is trying to criticize anyone or any model, really. But when you look at the models, the original assessment, first of all, that really hit everybody was the assessment that there's a mortality rate, a death rate of 3, 4, 5%. Of people that have infections from COVID-19 will die. And that right away, for most of us, was almost certainly wrong and an exaggeration, because most of the people who came forward were already sick. We didn't know how many people had this COVID infection. And now we know. And so when the projections were originally made, they immediately were changed to sort of incorporate the idea that a lot of people had it, that were asymptomatic. And so the other thing that you see is that the models are changing even though the assumptions have not changed. And this is what makes people skeptical. If you look at the IHME model, which is the most sort of used model by this administration and by most people, I would say, at least in the US, they made a projection of number of deaths originally on the order of 1 to 2 million in the US, based on nothing being done. And then they made another projection of, say, 1 to 200,000. And most people, the number was about 150,000 roughly. I may be a little bit off, based on total isolation. And now almost every few days, they're revising that with no change in policy. There's been no change in what's being done. It's just that more facts have come in. And so now the estimated deaths are in the 60,000 range by that same model. No change in assumption, just more facts. So models are necessarily based on assumptions that with incomplete data. So it's not a criticism. It's simply the way things are, that when you get more information, you have a more thoughtful and more accurate assessment of what's going on.
Along those lines, I want to give you some specific numbers. And I want to pretend I'm the governor of Iowa. We are one of the few states, that's where I live, That's where, even though we're all over the country, we're broadcasting. Our studio is there today. So we're one of the few states that did not do a shelter in place. Now, virtually everything is shut down here. You have like nowhere to go. They just made it that you couldn't get, no one could call the cops on you if you had your grandparents over for a kid's birthday party. But there's a de facto shutdown here just without a name, okay? Mm-hmm. That's set to expire a week from today with our governor. Here's the latest data that her office reported as of yesterday, Scott. All right, there's currently, we have a population of about 3.2 million. There's 272 people right now hospitalized around the state identified as because of SARS-2 coronavirus. 57 of them are in ICU on a ventilator, or 92 of them are in ICU around the state. 57 of them are currently on ventilators. We've had a total of 90 deaths. Given that data, if I was the governor of Iowa, what would you advise me to do when my current restrictions are due to expire a week from today?
Yeah, and actually I have been advising some state government elected officials and federal officials on how to reopen. So this is the question. This is the key question. How do you reopen? And the way to reopen is really to be targeted in your so-called isolation or social distancing. And this is really the point here. We know who is vulnerable to getting super sick, hospitalized, and particularly who might die. And that group of people is very well characterized by very elderly, and you almost always the people have chronic underlying conditions. So, okay, there's exceptional people who die or who get hospitalized and have a super bad course in the hospital that are not elderly, but they all have underlying conditions. I mean, the exception does not disprove the rule. So the numbers looking at New York City, for example, 99.2% of people who have been fully investigated for underlying conditions, 99.2% of them of the people who died have underlying conditions. So in Iowa, which is not New York City, and nowhere else in the United States is, let me just say something else. 60% of deaths in the United States are in the tri-state New York area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. So that really is very different from the rest of the country. So I think there can be a very smart recommendation and some stringent requirements on reentry. Number one, I would have a mandatory testing for all workers who work in a nursing home or senior care center. Mandatory testing. These people who live there, the elderly, most of them have a chronic condition underlying. That's why they're in the nursing home partly. These people need to be protected. And so that is, to me, a mandatory requirement that workers there must be tested. I think we need to be strategic in who else must be tested. It's all overblown, the requirement for testing, to me, in my opinion. The people who need to be tested are the pandemic workers and first responders, okay, because we can't have them attending patients and be infected. And then patients who are in the hospital need to be tested, because if they have it, they have to be isolated, and we have to know what to do with them, and we can't waste time doing other things for them when we need to focus on what needs to be done. So, and when we see these compassionate care uses of the Gilead drug, IV, which seems to be working preliminarily, these are people who get this IV drug because they're going to potentially die without it. So there's very targeted testing. It's strategic. And it's very important to isolate the vulnerable. That is the seniors, particularly in the nursing homes. Now, what else do you do? Well, you can open businesses. You can open most things, but you have to have at least a recommendation, and in my view, that's all it should be, to people who are seniors and with underlying conditions, that they need to maintain social distancing. That doesn't mean they need to be inside their house. There's a lot of literature besides common sense. There's medical literature that being outside in the air with the wind blowing disseminates and dilutes and contagious, organisms. So, I mean, it's sort of strange to think you cannot go outside. That to me is just, I don't want to say extreme words, but I just disagree with that completely. On the other hand, if you're in a closed space, okay, that's a different story. So social distancing should be highly recommended for people who are old with underlying conditions. Public transportation, okay, is a difficult challenge. Now, we know that these masks that people are talking about and a scarf over your face, there's mixed data on how effective they are, but I think it's reasonable to say if you're going to be in a closed compartment like that, like public transportation, I think it's reasonable to require some sort of protection for people who might be coughing. Okay, so whether it's a scarf or a mask or whatever in public transportation where it's crowded, yeah, it's totally reasonable. But to not have there's something very fundamental that's being overlooked. The overwhelming majority of people do not have any risk of dying. The overwhelming majority of people, if infected, do not have a serious disease, and it's highly exceptional for somebody who's young and healthy to get a serious illness or die. And so that information, knowing we have a confined, targeted population to protect, makes the policies easier to think through. If your bathroom needs to be renovated, you don't renovate the whole house. You fix the bathroom. We know we need to protect certain people here. Let's do a very good job of protecting them, but not go crazy and just simply shut down the economy. We know who dies, we know who gets hospitalized, and we know something else, which is a fundamental biology that's been known for a half a century or more, and it's in every virology book. The way that virus infections are controlled is by making sure enough people are immune to block the transmission, including the transmission to those who are vulnerable. It's like a network. You need to put up a lot of obstacles. The way we put up those obstacles are twofold. We let people get their own immunity by antibodies that you generate after being infected, and you immunize. They both do the same thing. Widespread immunization causes or creates this so-called herd immunity that people are talking about. And so in the beauty of this disease, and I don't mean to underplay its tragedy and the tens of thousands of people in the United States who have died and over 100,000 in the world. It's been disastrous. But the reality is that half the people who get infected have no symptoms. That's good, because that means we can allow a lot of people to get infected, those who are not at risk to die or have a serious hospital requiring illness. We should be fine with letting them get infected, generating immunity on their own. And the more immunity in the community, the better we can eradicate the threat of the virus, including the threat to people who are vulnerable. That's what herd immunity is. That's a basic principle. And the criticism that, well, we don't know. Okay, there's a lot we don't know. But we don't throw out all fundamental biology, all fundamental immunology, because we don't have all the answers yet. Meantime, in the background, we're working like crazy. We, not me, the scientific community, in the startup companies and the big companies on immunizations and on drugs. And that's all progressing. I feel like this is, even if there's a second hit of this in a year or next fall, winter, which there could be, nobody knows, but there could be, we're going to be in a totally different position, much more prepared, much more mobilized on how to distribute emergency equipment. We'll have a lot bigger stockpiles of everything. And we know that there's going to be more immunity.
That was a phenomenal answer. And you basically just summarized your piece that I was going to ask you to summarize anyway, Scott. So I've got only about 90 seconds. I need to ask you a difficult question, though, that I need to know the answer to as someone that has researched this so prevalently. How come doctors Birx and Fauci and the White House task force seemingly have only gone by the recommendations of the most apocalyptic experts and models out there. That, to me, has been one of the great mysteries of this saga. Do you have a potential answer to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't quite characterize it as that, actually. When I listen to Dr. Birx, I think she's fantastic. Very clear. You have to listen. She's using precise words. And this is not what the news media does, not what the headlines of newspapers are, not what typical people do. She speaks very, very eloquently and precisely on what she's saying. And she has been not only saying that we're doing the right things here, but she's laying the groundwork for re-entering society. And it is true. I think some of the things she says are maybe a little bit too sophisticated in a sense, but she's saying we need to use caution. But she's also saying something very important vis-a-vis your Iowa question. It's not true that the United States is New York. That statement was made originally unfortunately, by some of the leaders out east, that, okay, New York is what we're going to see in the rest of the country. That's just not true.